Welcome to FO Live, our signature panel discussion that brings together diverse views from around the world. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief. I'm representing Fair Observer, obviously. You're watching us on our YouTube channel. We are an independent non-profit media organization that has published more than 2,500 voices from over 90 countries. We believe in a plurality of perspectives. We believe in making sense of the world for you. Today, we make sense of Latin America. Before I carry on, I must ask our viewers on YouTube to subscribe to our channel, press the red button under this video, and get your friends to do so too. Do it right now. We have some great content for you already, and there is much more to come. All right, on to Latin America. There has been a historic election in Colombia, a new constitution in Chile, and change might be in the air for Brazil. Our guests today to make sense of it all are Leonardo Vivas, a very dear friend, an author at Fair Observer, a long-standing author at Fair Observer, and a professor at Emerson College. Maria Isabel Puerta, a professor at Valencia College. Christoph Sponcel, who is in Colombia, who is an author as well for us, and who's a PhD student at my alma mater, Oxford University. And then we have my very dear friend, long-standing author at Fair Observer, and a terrific Latin America analyst, Glenn Ojeda. So without further ado, paint us a picture. What is going on? Maria Isabel, go for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Fair Observer for this invitation. I think there is, on one side, there's a lot of expectation with this renewed pink tide, or at least that's what many analysts are looking at. But those who express that view also add some caveat to it. Not necessarily the one that we saw, especially if we go back to as far as, I don't know, Hugo Chavez coming to Venezuela, for example. It's not gonna look that way, perhaps, but also because we have this new leadership, for example, Boric in Chile. It's very different. This is a former student leader that we came to know through the protests. So this is a very different environment. So there is a lot of expectation, but there's also a lot of challenges. And these challenges go from social issues that have to be dealt with, the economy, post-pandemic economy. And in the case of Chile, there's a new constitution. In the case of Colombia, there's a huge divide in terms of what society is expecting from the government or the state. And how is it going to answer to those claims and demands, just as we see probably Lula going back to power in Brazil. And we have this crisis in Peru. And then we have Ecuador in hands of a right, I don't know if we can talk about center anymore, not just in Latin America, but in general. Democracies are failing to have moderate visions. So the challenge is that precisely. How do we have a different pink tide in Latin America with other political crises that we have, let's say Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba? So it's challenging.
So why this shift to the left? Glenn, what's going on, and why now?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for the Fair Observer for hosting this session. So over the last few years, since even before the onset on COVID, but particularly triggered by the inequalities that have been deepened through the pandemic and since 2020, there has been a lot of social unrest that has been either boiling or starting to create pressure under the surface. We saw it in Chile in 2020, which led to a new constitutional convention, whether it will be successful or not, that's still to be seen. We saw it in Colombia also, and we've seen it across the region. So the growing inequalities after a decade of commodities and booms in the regional economy are starting to come back now that the economic cycle is hitting a few snags. It has been over the last few years. There has been growing unrest, and governments of the traditional parties have not been responsive to the needs of the people. So that's why you see in places like Colombia, for the first time in decades, or some would argue ever, a left-wing government come to power. You see the return of the left, and some would say an even more radical left to Chile, the ascension of Boric, who is different from the Bachelet left or some of the other lefts that govern the country. And presidents like Castillo, who also came from that unrest of the people, a teacher. So we're seeing this change, which is somewhat different from the, I would call it, elite left that you had during the first pink tide. This is more of a left that responds to social unrest much more. And I would say to an extent it's less ideological than the earlier pink tide, which was very much an ideological left with great ideologues, Chavez himself, Correa, and others.
So what you're saying is there was a super cycle because of Chinese demand. Latin American economies went through a boom period, and during that boom period, inequalities exacerbated, but they didn't really lead to unrest that much, as long as the rising tide lifted all boats. Now that the economy is arguably moving into another super cycle, you have a populist left that is not ideological, or not as ideological in any case as the previous governments, and it is championing policies that are more about equity, more about redistribution, and more about a change from the status quo. Would that be a fair summary?
That's a fair summary at a high level, correct.
Brilliant. Now, let me turn to Leonardo Vivas and ask him, you've already alluded to it, and ask him, how is this reminiscent of the past, this tide? You've already delineated some differences. And what is really different, or how is this tide really different this time around?
There are a number of important differences here. And thank you, Atul, for the invitation, and thank you to the other panelists. As it's been said, you know, the ideological question is very important. Not only because you had kind of a response to let's say the shortcomings of the Washington Consensus at the time, but also because there was this idea and this urge to break with the United States. So it had a very important international connection. So during that period, were created a number of organizations, regional like UNASUR, that were organized, represent South America. You had CELAC, which was all the Americas except US and Canada, which was a clear move to have a break with the United States. And you had also ALBA, which was more kind of a Chavez and the Castro's connection with the closer allies. So you had that, and as well, most of these regimes that came that were installed were, you know, on the wave of the commodities boom, and that helped. So to a very important extent, for instance, all these organizations were promoted with the deep pockets of Chavez, because, you know, the oil boom at some point brought oil prices to, you know, $103 a barrel. So as has been said, now the situation is more having to do with the response to COVID, the pandemic. You know that Latin America has been one of the regions, if not the region, where the impact of the pandemic has been the worst. And it has clearly changed and shifted regimes, not only to the left, they had shifted regimes all over. Like, for instance, you had the change in Ecuador, but in general terms, it responds to the cycle of the commodities boom going down, and to the response to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. So to just dig deeper on it, the pandemic was terrible for the Latin American economies. They shrunk, and they exacerbated inequalities and other differences. And what does this change represent economically? Because as you know, it's not just Latin America. Boris Johnson will be out of power soon. Mario Draghi resigned in Italy. We are seeing tremendous political upheaval because, as I said about the economic consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war, that is causing ripples across the world. In the case of Latin America, yes, we are seeing ripples too, but what are the new policies at such a trying time? Because budgets are going to be limited. I mean, they're constrained. Countries already running deficits, I suppose.
Well, I think Marisabel pointed to one aspect that is very significant, and it has to be with the crisis of democracy, because it's not only in Latin America that it's happening, but because Latin America has always had the temptation of populism. In fact, you could say to a certain extent that as a massive movement, populism was in the 20th century a Latin American invention. But now, of course, it has been spread out all over the world. So what we can witness is the question of instability. Political instability has become the name of the game in Latin America. And even if you had kind of from, let's say, mid of the 90s to 2012, let's say, you had kind of a rather stable conditions in the region, with some exceptions. But now you have alterations all over. So many of the traditional parties have been run out of office. Many other problems have become a part of the agenda that were not really properly in there. And then all this instability has made, opened the door for newcomers, like, the case of Bukele in El Salvador, which started like a populist and now is becoming clearly from the right more autocratic, more authoritarian than used to be, let's say, the average in the region.
All right, so let's move on to Colombia, where Christoph is right now, and you can tell us what's going on from the ground. I mean, what has happened in Colombia and why, Christoph?
Sure. Yeah, first of all, first, thank you very much, Atul, for the invitation. It's great to share this hour with you. What has happened in Colombia? So Colombia, and I think that's, and adding to what Leonardo just was saying, that's perhaps one of the things that's different this time. Colombia was always had right-leaning governments, was always, to different extents, further or far-right governments, and also in the 2000s when the rest of the continent was governed by the so-called linked left tide. So that's one of the key differences I would think is also happening this time. The reason is that Colombia had a long-standing conflict for decades with three main actors: the left-leaning guerrillas on one side, the government on one side, with strong alliances with right-leaning paramilitary groups. And that conflict kind of prohibited or made it impossible for the left to articulate itself, because as soon as trade unions or leftist political parties stepped forward with concepts, it was very easy to stigmatize them as being linked to the guerrilla, such that leftist political ideas never had much space to develop. However, in 2016, the government signed a peace agreement with the largest guerrilla group, the FARC. And because of that, that process transformed the society, and now it was suddenly it was much more possible for progressive and leftist platforms to be heard and to articulate themselves in the country. The biggest manifestation of that were protests, countrywide, months-long protests in 2019 and 2021, which, similar to what happened in Chile and Ecuador, were mostly demanding a fairer distribution of income and of wealth, but also because the inequality, as Leonardo and Maria rightly pointed out, was exacerbated by the pandemic. So these protests then created kind of a mass movement, which then enabled the rise of the leftist candidate in this year's presidential elections, Gustavo Petro, who won in a second round a few weeks ago in late June, and now is the first leftist president Colombia has ever had. What has happened since then? First of all, it was very surprising that all sectors of society accepted that rise of the left and accepted Petro's victory. Many observers had anticipated that perhaps there would be a military coup, or there would be some non-acceptance of the electoral results by the political right, but nothing like that happened. So the elections can be seen as a great strengthening for Colombian democracy. And also his reaction since then, he has appointed mostly ministers from the political center, many of them linked to the previous government of Juan Manuel Santos, who signed and who was responsible for negotiating the 2016 peace agreement. And he has also reached across political aisles. For example, he has assigned as foreign minister Alvaro Leiva, who in the past used to be a member of the Conservative Party, so who was more a representative of the establishment. Or he has reached out to have meetings with Uribe, Colombia's two-term president from the far right, who was the main opponent of the peace agreement. So all these signs, what Petro calls a national accord, Acuerdo Nacional, show that he's willing to make coalitions across the political spectrum. And he, in my opinion, that kind of strengthened democracy in Colombia, because Colombia is heavily polarized, and reaching out to other political corners is a surprising and relevant first step to overcome that polarization. And the results so far, I mean, it's 1 week after his possession into office, so it's of course too early to judge. But just it seems that the Colombian population is in line with him. His approval ratings jumped from around 40% on the day of the second round of the elections to, in the latest polls, around 60%. So, well, it's too early to judge. The first signs seem that democracy has strengthened, at least through these past elections in Colombia.
Well, that's interesting. You should say so, because Maria Isabel had a slightly different view. Maria Isabel, Leonardo, Glenn, do you have anything to add to what Christoph just said?
Yeah, I'll add. Oh, go ahead, Leonardo.
No, go.
Yeah, I'll add on the specific case of Colombia, and as Christoph very well just painted the picture there. We see the difference of this pink tide with the previous one, because there's not that commodities boom and the economic dynamics are very different. The Petro government is having to hit the ground running, and its first major reform that they're presenting, it's a tax reform, reforma tributaria, that is raising flags amongst, I would say, many spectrums or all spectrums of Colombian society, because it was tax reform that led to the protests and the social unrest in 2019. So Petro and his new foreign minister, or sorry, finance minister, are having to tread very carefully in how they present the reform, a reform that is only meant to target the wealthiest Colombians, corporations, to persecute tax evaders, and trying to paint it as something that won't affect the working class or the middle class, because obviously that's who votes for them, that's their base constituency. But it reflects this reality that there's no commodities boom that's going to finance 4 years of Petro spending. So the first thing they got to do is get the checkbook in order.
Yeah, and interest rates are high too. So they can't just go and borrow cheaply as Latin American countries once did, and interest rates are rising. And we know from the example of Sri Lanka, what can happen if you have too much external debt.
Yeah, another aspect that I would like to mention is the international part, because Colombia has been the closest ally of the US for at least 4 decades. And it's the recipient of the
Seems that we
lost Leo, it seems.
Seems that we lost Leonardo.
Yeah. Well, what a pity. I think he'll be back.
Yeah.
I was going to add to that, not to the international perspective, but Colombia and Petro are in a place where Petro cannot risk to alienate the coalition he's built in terms of the Congress. So that's one thing to recognize. The other is he won. There's no doubt about that, but he knows he won because the option of Hernandez was so fringe that people who would have likely voted for another candidate had to vote for Petro just to stop, further, this Trumpian style of candidate. So he didn't get, he won. I insist. There's no doubt about it. But he has to keep that coalition together. And he has a lot of aspirations, for example, when it comes to replace, the extractivism. He's got great ambitions to climate, address climate change and all the environmental perspective in his agenda. Will need, I'm not saying a friendly kind of relationship with the US, but he will need it as an ally. So that will likely come into place once they have to deal with, how are they going to straighten their, both countries, US and Colombia, when it comes to drug trafficking, the peace accords. I mean, he knows he can't get everything on that, to-do list that he has. He knows he has a lot of limits, not just because his broad coalition, but as you guys said, interest rates, the economy. So he might be very ambitious in terms of what he wants to achieve, but he has to become a little bit more down to earth and pragmatic with what he will in fact achieve. So I think he has to balance both, the expectations as well.
Understood. So he's built a broad coalition, and the coalition could disintegrate. And so he very much will have to practice the politics of the possible and compromise and try his best that the coalition holds and doesn't go towards more extreme candidates, both on his left and right. Now this brings me on to Chile, because Chile, it seems, did end up with, some would say, a more radical leftist president, as Glenn alluded to. And now they are coming up with a new constitution. The country is coming up with a new constitution, or Chileans are coming up with the new constitutions to replace the one that General Pinochet left behind for them. the military dictator who ruled Chile for many years. So Glenn, tell us what is going on in Chile. What is the latest on the new constitution? It has been a rather prolonged process. And why is this process turning out to be so messy and so turbulent and so protracted?
Yeah, and why it might ultimately fail. But that's a great buildup. So Chile, as many of you know, and we've alluded here, had a prolonged period of social unrest in 2019 that went into 2020. And then the social unrest during the Piñera presidency was somewhat subdued or calmed down by this promise of a plebiscite to rewrite the Chilean constitution. And the Chilean people voted overwhelmingly, about 2 to 1, in favor of let's have a new constitutional convention so that we can work over a year period or 18-month period to rewrite a new constitution, one that isn't the legacy of a dictator. The problem is that this constitutional convention became, unfortunately, a sort of populist circus, and it overexerted itself beyond its mandate. So obviously a constitution, not just in Chile, but in any country, has the vocation of setting the rules for the democratic game. And this constitution tried to get into more legislating and dictating how the life of everyday Chileans and businesses and education should be, instead of reframing itself, of holding itself back and just reframing broad strokes how the nation can work, how it should elect its assemblies, and how its democracy should function. And now, as of July, the Constitutional Convention is done with its legislative work, with its drafting. Now on the 4th of September, so about 3 weeks from now, on Sunday, September 4th, the Chileans will vote as to whether they accept the new constitution or not, and whether it becomes the law of the land, or if the voting fails, then the constitution that's in place will remain in place. And it seems that the most recent polls, the constitution as drafted will fail. It will not obtain a majority. So what is likely to happen is that the constitution that is in place will remain in place. And obviously that creates a bind for President Boric, who was elected after the Constitutional Assembly had been convened. And one of his campaign promises was to roll out the new constitution. So now he's in a tough position, because the constitution that he sort of championed will get voted down, and he has to find a way to reform the current constitution, because all the left-wing parties, including his own, have denounced this dictatorial constitution, or this constitution that is legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship. So he's floated around a few ideas, doing constitutional amendments, doing an extension so that the Constitutional Assembly can meet again and review their work. But there's no easy way out, and we'll see September 4th that probably the constitution that they've been working on for the last year or so will be voted down.
Wow. I mean, if that happens, that would present a staggering loss of face, because after all, this was a new assembly. This was an assembly with a mandate, came on the back of the backs of massive nationwide protests. And it seems they have overreached. It seems that what they have drafted doesn't seem to represent what the people want, and the people are willing to go back to a military era constitution. Well, in some ways, Maria Isabel, that is a triumph of democracy, isn't it?
I think there's, and Latin America is the perfect scenario for this debate. And I think we're going to talk about it more if the China dimension enters the scene. but
it will. Trust me, it will.
So here's what I see in terms of the debate about democracy in Latin America. Right now, what we see is a huge response to this anti-incumbent sentiment that no one should take for granted that this is just me supporting a left government or a right-wing government. It will likely happen with to Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? But it can happen to the left as well. So this is something that I think brings us to the conversation about what democracy is really facing right now. The challenge is coming from illiberal forces. It doesn't matter if it's right or left. The problem is that confrontation between democracy and autocracy. And that's, I think, what's at play right now in Latin America. And that's what to be honest, I feel like we not lose time, waste time, but I do feel like we're not calling it as it is when we make it. And I think Leonardo was right. And you've all expressed it in some way. This is not an ideological battle, because what they use are the tools that democracy gives them through elections. Just look at Bukele. Leonardo mentioned the case. Just look at them, how they use elections to reach power and then just subvert the order. It happened here in the US where I live. So
going back to that, Maria Isabel, in some ways you can't say it is autocracy versus democracy, because you don't have the equivalent of the Chinese Communist Party. Cuba, you could argue, is autocracy. So I think that would be simplistic. But what you're saying is you're seeing populism, and you're seeing the continuation of the caudillo culture, and which we have in India too. You get a strong man or a strong woman voted in, and then they rule it like a personal fiefdom. And what you're seeing is the population votes one set of bums out and votes another set of bums in. And there is the anti-incumbency factor, which you see in many, actually you see it in India as well. And that is, whilst that is all true, it is still in some ways a democracy, imperfect though it may be. It's not descended into autocracy, because Chile, yes, they voted in a left-wing person, but they will vote down the constitution because the person overreached. So, Latin America has come a long way since the days of CIA-backed military governments or communist Soviet Union-backed communist insurgencies. So in that sense, the Latin America has come a very long way. We have Leonardo Vivas who's back. Yes, sir. Shoot.
But you don't have to have a kind of the classic dictatorship or a communist type rule regime in order to have an autocracy. Precisely the characteristic of autocracies nowadays is that most of them are built from democracies, and they start eroding different types of institutions, especially those that are weaker, and until it comes to a point where mostly the executive gets almost total power, and all the others, and you lack any kind of way of controlling the power of the executive, and that happened in Latin America. It happened with Chavez. It happened with Correa. To a lesser extent, happened to Evo Morales, and that was the left. And now you're having, as Maria says, you're having it with Bolsonaro, and you're having it with Bukele, and who knows, who's going to be the next, if it's going to be left or right. And the issue here is that the main way to go into autocratic rule is usually the populist fashion, because it creates the way to get the leader, the guerrilla to have a direct connection with the population with no intermediaries, no political parties, less Congress, and all that. So I think things are quieter now, but we don't know. At any point in time, it could happen again.
All right, brilliant. So this is a perfect segue for my next question. It leads on very nicely to the next question I have, and that is, what are the trends to watch out for in Latin America?
Are you asking me already?
Why don't you start? Because you've been already shining the light on it.
Well, I would say that there are a number of aspects. Most of the countries are going to have very important economic and social pains, because you won't have in the near and any time near a commodities boom again. And after the pandemic, if Latin America was having trouble, the pandemic made it far greater. I'll just give you an example. The number of people that left poverty in Latin America during, let's say, from the mid-90s to the 2012, I mean, we're talking of hundreds of millions of people that left poverty, especially in Brazil, the big countries, in Mexico, Brazil, but even in places like Dominican Republic, Panama, Peru. So many of these countries are now suffering not only the lack of the commodities boom, but you have the impact of the pandemic on top of that. So you're having that aspect, and you don't have the usual kind of instrument that to get the necessary income to put together state policy to make it. I mean, that is something that Petro's going to be facing, especially because Petro is saying that he wants to diminish the role of oil in Colombia. And we know that oil has been in the last, 40 years or more in Colombia, an important component of national income.
I see. So, Christoph, I can see you want to jump in. Shoot, please.
Yeah, in terms of the trends, first of all, commenting on the commodity, on the relevance of commodities, which undoubtedly is still the biggest export for most of Latin American economies. Mm-hmm. Two things here. I mean, it's true that on the one side, demand is obviously on a global level diminishing, which has severe implications. But when we have a look closer, we also see that the prices are much higher, and that for certain commodities, given that Western sanctions on Russia imply that European and North American countries need other sources for the commodities, I'm not entirely sure whether for sure we see such terrible implications for Latin America, because demand partly might shift to these countries in the region and prices are high. So just for example, taking the Colombian case, and the current economic data actually looks very promising. And the latest economic report of the outgoing Duque administration showed that tax income for the incoming Petro administration will be actually higher than they previously expected. So I think it's we need to be careful with too early judging of what the implications actually are on international commodity markets. Of course, one key factor is also to see what's going on in China, how demand from China will develop, because that's ultimately going to be a key factor on the demand side. Looking specifically at Colombia, I think also here the implications of Petro's commodity policies will not be seen during his presidency, because what he has announced is not to stop oil exploration, but to stop new oil explorations. And oil field explorations are very long-standing processes that take many years. So I think the actual production levels of Colombian oil will not going to go down significantly during his presidency. So I think the impact of his policies on oil income will be rather limited. I think a third thing one needs to look at is on potentials of unity in Latin America. Now that the continent, for the first time, all the major economies of the continent, assuming that Lula will win in Brazil, have leftist-leaning governments. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what it means, how Latin American countries position themselves towards the US, towards China, towards Russia or the European Union, and if that unity brings out certain synergies and alliances that we haven't seen so far. I think it's going to be something very interesting to observe in the next years.
Well, good to know. I mean, as I hear it, there are two big things that are shaping Latin American economies, two external economic shocks. One is the supply side, Russia. Now, oil is obviously running very high, so countries like Colombia, Venezuela in particular, can now have a greater revenue stream. And of course, nickel comes from Russia, copper comes from Russia. Russia is a huge supplier of commodities and agricultural goods. So that may be very good for Brazil, Argentina as well, in some ways, the rise in food prices. So the impact, the supply side shock from Russia might actually benefit Latin America. So that's on the positive ledger. But on the demand side, that's where a wobbly world economy, in particular, the implosion of the Chinese economy, as we are seeing with the real estate, with manufacturing, with increasing tensions over Taiwan, that's where the implosion of Chinese demand might actually put a brake on the Latin American economy. So there is this curious accelerator effect and a brake effect. And what you're saying is it's too early to tell, to quote a Chinese leader, Zhou Enlai, he said, too early to tell about the French Revolution. He actually meant it about 1968. It was construed as 1789. Let's assume the effects are not as dire. Even so, what do the latest trends mean? Not just for the other countries, but in particular for Venezuela and Cuba. Leonardo, you would probably have a lot to say. You're from Venezuela. You know a lot about Cuba. So over to you, sir.
Well, I think things are going to ease out a little bit for Cuba, but it wouldn't impact too much. Mm-hmm. Because the main question here is how is there going to be, what's going to be the relationship with the U.S. And there are always, between Cuba and the U.S., you have kind of back discussions and secret discussions taking place all the time. Recently, you had this huge fire that exploded in a refinery in Cuba, and you had the states offering help to go help the fire. So I think that things are not going to be as terrible, or are not as terrible as they used to be during Trump. In the case of Venezuela, it's totally different, because Venezuela was totally isolated from the world, and there were 60 countries that and mostly Western democracies and most Latin America that rejected the government, that did not accept the government as legitimate. And that has been changing, changing, and to the extent that you've had new leftist countries coming onto the stage here in Latin America. The case of Colombia is very important or decisive because it's a neighbor. It's the main neighbor, where you have approximately 1.52 million Venezuelans that migrated to Colombia, and that is a very important factor, and as well as economic relations in the border. Venezuela and Colombia used to be the countries that had the highest level of of commercial exchange for a couple of decades, and that has changed dramatically with the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. But the most important part is that Petro will have normal relations with Venezuela, and that will, I mean, facilitate perhaps that other countries will support this new position, and Venezuela will cease to be, the Maduro regime will cease to be isolated as it used to be until recently.
All right. Well, you know, there's also the possibility that that regime might offer cut price oil, just as India is buying oil from Russia because it has to contain inflation. There could be a possibility that other regimes around the world, not just Latin America, might start buying discounted Venezuelan oil. So that may end up strengthening Maduro.
The problem is that the Venezuela is already suffering very, very strict sanctions in terms of commercialization of oil. And they've managed to do this. They used to do it with Russia, and then they did it with India. That's been very successful, and Iran. But not many other countries have been willing to do this. So perhaps the Petro government, the incoming Petro government, might help to, you know, facilitate some of these sanctions to be diminished, or, you know, put a bit on the hold. You already have pressures internally here in the United States to have these change in these sanctions, especially, you know, big operators like Chevron have been putting pressure to change the sanctions. But at the same time, you have other kind of pressure, other kind of sanctions like financial sanctions, and those affect many other companies and many other actors in the world, not necessarily all producers. So I think it'll take time. And then finally, the question is that I don't see the oil producing company, the Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, going to produce, you know, 3 times oil by the end of the year or next year, because
they don't have the investment and the capacity and the technological expertise.
No, because it's the oil production in Venezuela practically collapsed, and it went from 3.1 million barrels a day up to 700,000 nowadays. You know, roundabout, and the question is, you haven't had new exploration. You have very few rigs working. You have most of the refineries in dire straits, most of them closed down except for one, producing gasoline. So, you know, the situation, you needed tons of investment to get the Venezuelan production, you know, up and running again.
All right. Now, this brings me on to a key question. We talked about investment in Latin America historically has had investment coming in from the US, and then, of course, the Soviet Union, and then recently China. And what do the latest developments in Latin America mean for the role of China and the US? And since Maria Isabel, you wanted to discuss China, over to you.
So I think it's really important what Leonardo just said, because I think it helps to understand why China and Russia have an entry in Latin America under these conditions. It's not that they weren't there. It's just that, for example, China had to cut back on the investment, and Russia doesn't have an economy big enough to make efforts as big as the Chinese government was. But in the case of Argentina, I understand that the investments are pretty good compared to what they had to do with Venezuela, but that's a different story. they had to do it because of the mismanagement in the Venezuelan government. So that's why we have them paying with oil all the debt they still have with China. However, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, things have changed a little. We have the Chinese government going, I think they've been there in Africa for at least a decade, and it seems that they're going to keep investing in Africa. But there's a scenario where the Chinese government sees the weaknesses of the Russian economy being an opening for them, not just in other places they usually go to invest, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, but to look again at Latin America. They have issues with their economy. I think we've understood that there are some setbacks in terms of their growth this year, right?
Massive.
But they are betting on them to kind of surpass Russia as the leading or the emerging pole in that multipolar system they think is possible to be the outcome of this crisis,
Maria,
of the leadership.
Sorry to interrupt, but economically, Russia doesn't matter. Russia's GDP is tiny.
No, exactly.
So economically,
exactly.
China is the pole. That is what people in the CIA think. That's what people in the Pentagon think. In fact, I know of people who say off the record that the US should not be fighting the Russians. Instead, they should be focusing on the Chinese.
On China.
So there are a large number of people who believe that China is the challenger. Russia is immaterial. It is an annoyance. It is a very mighty country militarily. It is a fortress economy. It can give a supply shock to the world economy and bring the world economy to its knees. But as of now, it is the Chinese who are the real menace. And in Latin America, in Africa, because China is the workshop of the world, because China manufactures everything. The laptop I'm using to speak is manufactured in China. Both the phones I have in front of me, you know, are Chinese.
All of them.
All of them. So the point is, naturally, if you're a manufacturing power, you'll import from places where you find commodities. And even before the US broke onto the scene, Latin America and Africa were supplying commodities to Europe when Europe was manufacturing. So this is just natural. The question I have is more specific, is what happens to the Chinese role now that you have populist leftist movements in charge? Will they make concessions to get more investment from China? And will China jump on the bandwagon? Or will they interact more with the institutions in Washington, D.C. to fund their programs? After all, Brazil lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty thanks to the Bolsa Familia program and some others. So the question now is, where's the money going to come from? And who plays a bigger role economically and geopolitically, China or the US?
I think right now it depends on how the US is going to reframe their foreign policy, specifically with this impasse that seems to be a little bit more than that after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. I think they have to straighten their policy towards not just Taiwan, but China. So that's going to depend pretty much on what they decide. And I don't think that's clear, even for the Biden administration. It's not just because of the pressure Republicans are putting on this issue. It's the fact that we are still not out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic. We know that China is not meeting their expectation for growth, for economic growth. And I was looking at some other numbers. They're not even close to what their expectation was in terms of dealing with COVID and more lockdowns that could come and put more strain.
Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy has been a complete and absolute
disaster.
Unmitigated disaster. So we are in flux, and the trends you see are mixed. Let me move on to Glenn and then Christoph, and then Leonardo, you can have the last word before we open it for questions. what role will the external players play? Because historically they have played a big role in Latin America because it's such a commodities dependent economy. It's not a self-contained economy like the US or even the EU.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier, Atul, the two dynamics of the demand shock, rather the supply shock caused by Russia going offline and the demand shock caused by China's economy imploding.
Yeah.
I think that puts Latin America in a good place, but also in a bad place. It puts Latin America in the good place that it can fill the void left by Russia, but in a bad place because it needs to find a new customer if China is gone. And it will come down to the decisions made in DC and the decisions made in Beijing. So to an extent, it is out of the hands of Petro or Boric or Castillo. It's really in Washington and in Beijing that they have to choose. Biden would have to choose over the next months, maybe year, but particularly months. Are we going to be pragmatic in facing these pink tide governments? And even though they might not be the friendliest, are we going to approach them? Are we going to reroute our supply chains through Latin America because it is a safer partner? It is nearshoring. It is friendshoring as opposed to offshoring to some other Asian country. Are we going to be pragmatic in our approach? And are we going to ask our trade ambassadors, our companies to, set up shop in Mexico or in Colombia or in Brazil, as opposed to Indonesia or China? And then it will also come down to the power that Xi Jinping comes out with after the Congress in the fall in China. If he comes out strengthened and if the Chinese economy has money to spend, and if he has the appetite for a deep dive into Latin America, then he could give the U.S. a further run for his money, for the U.S.'s money, because he would find friendly governments. But I don't know if China has the appetite right now. I don't know if they're in a position to do that. And I think in Latin America, because this is not, as we were saying earlier, this is not an ideological wave. They'll take whoever comes. If the U.S. comes and wants to do business, Petro and Boric and even Castillo and AMLO, none of them will turn them away. They'll sit down to the table with whoever wants to discuss. That was a bit different in the first pink tide of the early 2000s when there was that ideological divide. But right now, it's up for the taking. And I hope that the Biden administration is practical enough to see through that and doesn't abandon the region. It would be a big strategic mistake to lose the backyard to foreign influence.
So it's a case of show me the money, and Latin America is waiting and watching to see whether Beijing or Washington shows them the money.
But the question is, if you look historically at the last 2 or 3 decades, the trend of the kind of investment that China is willing to support, mostly infrastructure.
Yes.
It has grown at a higher pace than whatever other kind of investment the U.S. has been making. So to reverse that trend is going to be an uphill battle, and I'm not sure if the Biden administration gives that great importance to the region at the moment.
Yeah, I also think, going back to your question, Atul, whether anything will change in these trends with the new governments, I don't think that's the case, because if we look at the past, the acceptance of Chinese investments was completely independent of the political direction of the current government in the different countries. For example, in Brazil, during the Trump administration, Bolsonaro was very much willing to go to overcome the Trump policies and outsource telecommunication infrastructure to Chinese investments, and not following at all demands by the US administration back then, whereas several other leftist governments were equally fond of getting Chinese investments, because very often the conditions for these investments were just much less strict than for example, financing by international bodies such as the World Bank or the IMF. So I think it has been in the past, regardless of political affiliation, and I think it will continue to do so, and will be pragmatic, and Latin American governments will happily accept investments no matter where it comes from. And looking at the Colombian case, I think, yes, Colombia now has a leftist government, but the first signs so far seem that the Biden administration is very pragmatic in its approach towards it. In fact, communication between the new Petro administration has been much closer than it was 4 years ago when the Duque administration was put in place, and links seem to be stronger now than they used to be 4 years ago. So even though there's a shift in the political direction in Colombia, I don't think so far, and with the current US administration, it doesn't seem like there are major shifts or there's a deterioration of relationships.
Brilliant, but it'll be a question of who can find the money. In the US, with its very high debt, inflation, and domestic spending, may not have the money, despite wanting to put a premium on Latin America. So we don't know. The jury's out. And the Chinese may not have the money either. They have a bad debt crisis on their bank. They have a financial crisis, especially when it comes to real estate on their hands. So it may be a very interesting world we live in. Yes, Glenn.
Yeah, I would say if it comes from the US, to your point and to Leonardo's point, it would have to come from private industry. That it's clear. It would have to be US corporations receiving a mandate. Let's go to Latin America, and they accepting that mandate.
Understood. Very valuable. Any questions from our audience before we sign off? I'll give you 10 seconds to shoot. Well, it seems we have no questions. You have enlightened everyone so profoundly that everyone has become the Buddha, and they're all willing to go home and reflect on what you've said. Well, those of you watching us on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. Press the red button, subscribe now. Make sure you get your friends to subscribe too. And of course, sign up for our free newsletter. Follow us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and even Instagram. And those of you who want to join the conversation, publish with us. Go to our website, fairobserver.com/publish. We welcome perspectives from around the world. And this is it from me, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief, Atul Singh. From all of us at Fair Observer, it's bye for now.